Hello and welcome back to the Global Gaming Business Podcast, the industry's first and longest running podcast now in our 19th year. As always, I am your host, Jess Marquez, and our guest today is Peter Cohen, Director of Regulatory Affairs at the Agenda Group, to talk about the wild ride that the Australian gaming market has been on and what it may look like moving forward. Today's GGB podcast is sponsored by Pavilion Payments, which empowers gaming institutions to create an enhanced patron experience with a complete suite of integrated payment solutions that enable safe, secure, and trusted cash access at the cage, on the casino floor, or online. Learn more at pavilionpayments.com. Those in the gambling world have long considered Australia to be perhaps the most prolific market in the world per capita. But in recent years, regulatory scandals and other mishaps have shaken Aussie gaming to its core, and now the future is murkier than ever. Peter Cohen spent more than a decade as a regulator in Victoria before transitioning over to the consultancy side. He and I spoke about these recent developments down under via Zoom in June. Peter, thank you so much for joining me today, all the way across the world from Melbourne. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm great, Jess, and thank you for the invitation.
Of course. And so my time, my time is a little bit off. So it's the evening here, so it's like middle of the morning for you, right?
Well, 9 in the morning in
Gotcha.
Melbourne right now.
Gotcha. The wonders of modern technology, right? I mean, who would have
Oh, it's
thought?
great. It's fantastic to be able to do this in the way that we're doing it.
Definitely. So this has been, and I told you this off air, but this has been one of my most anticipated interviews that I've done in a long time because today is going to be all things Australia. This is a market that is extremely important in the overall gaming ecosystem. It is commonly referred to as maybe the most, I don't know what you want to call, maybe the most prolific market in terms of just the appetite for gaming. I mean, there's like all these statistics that I see about how 50 some odd percent of Australian adults, partake in some form of gambling. It is commonly listed as one of the bellwether markets in terms of slot design, all these different things that tie back. There's so many, companies that have such a big presence in the world, like the aristocrats that are, obviously from Australia. Um, and it's just been a crazy market. The last, multiple years now, 3, 4, 5 years have just been really a whirlwind. I don't know if there's any other way to describe it. So we're gonna try to kind of touch on a lot of different things. Obviously, this could be a 3 hour movie if you wanted it to be, with all the developments that have happened in recent years. But we're gonna kind of want to go section by section here. Um, so thank you again. But I kind of want to start from like a very overarching picture from of things, in the sense that if, and I was thinking about this earlier this afternoon, but when I was getting ready for this interview, but like if I were to talk to somebody who didn't know anything about gaming and who was not familiar with the industry at all and didn't know anything, and if I were to explain to them how the last, say, 3 years have been for the Australian market, I think it would be something along the lines of like everybody got in trouble, everybody has paid dearly for it, and nobody really knows where it's going to go from here. Is that a pretty, from a general perspective, would you say that that's been a pretty astute observation, or how would you categorize it?
It's a good start. It's been a horror movie, and it's been hard to believe that it has gone downhill as quickly as it has. So, a couple of things to keep in mind: Australians are the world's largest gamblers per capita.
Sure.
One of the reasons for that is because most forms of gambling are readily available and properly regulated. So there's a marketplace that's fair and people have access. So access is a big thing. So if you think of every form of gambling you can think of, all of them are, or virtually all of them are available in Australia, with the one exception of online gaming. But within online gaming, there is an exception, and that allows online sports betting. So the online gaming that's banned are things like casino games and video slots and social gaming like that. Everything else is legally available. And there's a complex backstory which relates to the funding of the state. So gambling is regulated at the state and territory level in Australia. There are 8 states and territories. And the reason the states and territories pursue gambling is because it's a source of revenue for them. Because under the Australian Constitution, the sources of revenue that states can raise are extremely limited. So gambling is one of the ones that they're free to pursue. And because they love their gambling taxes, they pursue it. So access is provided by governments wanting the gambling to exist because it provides them with substantial tax revenue from which they can do their policy initiatives that are of interest to them.
Well, it's interesting. The the government's wanting tax revenue. I'm not familiar with that idea. That here in the U.S. we don't talk about that at all. That's a completely foreign completely foreign concept here. So it makes perfect sense. So for anybody who may not have seen or is not familiar with, basically what we're referring to in terms of the last few years is that pretty much every one of the major operators, land-based casino operators, whether it be Star Entertainment, Crown Resorts, Sky City Entertainment, they've pretty much all undergone some form of suitability inquiry. Pretty much all of them have paid millions of Australian dollars, tens of millions of Australian dollars in anti-money laundering fines. We've seen license revocations. We've seen license reinstatements. We've seen boards of directors cleared out wholesale. We've seen changes in regulatory structure. I mean, we've really seen it all. Um, and I think that it just paints a really interesting picture of, like we've said, a market that really is an important piece of the overall structure. And for someone like yourself, I want to back up a little bit and just kind of, give the audience, obviously, anyone who's not familiar with you, you've been in the market for decades, and you were a regulator yourself for, I believe you said, was it 15 years or close to it?
Something like that. I joined the Victorian State Regulator in 1996, and I became its CEO in 2008 and a commissioner, and left at the end of, sorry, I became a CEO and commissioner in 2002 and left after 8 years at the end of 2010. And I've been consulting since. So I was with the regulator from 96 to 2010.
So you've seen the evolution of this market really from its early stages in terms of the land-based side, and then all the way up until relatively recently. So your experience, your previous experience, like what is it like for someone like yourself who's seen that evolution firsthand? Like, how do you react to the last few years of how everything has kind of gone? I mean, I know it's like a big topic, like it's an overarching topic, but I mean, like, what has been your reaction to a lot of these developments, especially that they've come so quickly, one after the other after the other?
I think surprise bordering on shock would probably be the first emotional response when these stories initially broke back in about 2018, I suspect, was the first sort of story. In fact, the story might not have broken until about 2019, but it related to activities that started in 2016.
Sure.
And it was a surprise then. It remains a surprise today at the level of um, harm that the industry put itself in, is where I'm going with this. But it's also the harm they allow their players to receive as well, their lack of care with things like money laundering and so on. It's difficult to understand why it happened or how it happened. But at the same time as the industry seemed to lose its way, I think gambling regulators in Australia did likewise and allowed it to happen. So gambling's regulated at the state and territory level. So you've got a state-based regulator in each case, and Star and Crown between them operate in 4 different jurisdictions. And each of those regulators has had to effectively go through a process of reform. There's also a federal money laundering regulator called AUSTRAC, which is like FinCEN in America. It also appeared to have been a bit lacking in its endeavours and its watchfulness over the industry, and it has, I feel like, pulled itself together as well. And so it is now targeting that industry much more than it was previously. So the industry has brought a lot of this upon itself. I mean, there was a major inquiry, and one of the inquiries in referring to the regulators not doing its job well, and I'm paraphrasing what was said, but the chairman of the inquiry said, just because there's no security guard on the door of the bank doesn't mean you can rob it. And that is sort of an analysis, a very nice little cliched way of saying the industry is expected to behave itself even if a regulator is not doing its job properly.
Definitely. And, I want to touch more on the regulated role of it in a little bit, but if we get to kind of the current reality, if you will, or I guess, and from a business perspective, it would be the current operating environment. Um, I feel like to a certain degree, a lot of the dust has kind of settled in terms of, Crown has obviously been, for the most part, made whole again. They obviously are facing a tough environment in terms of the lack of VIP. The VIP segment is largely gone from the market. They're experiencing a lot of trouble, even though they have gone through a lot of change. You have Star, on the other hand, who, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if anyone has followed the Star the last 6 months. It has been rocky to say the least. They may not have as rosy of a picture. They're currently awaiting the second Bell, the results of the second Bell inquiry, which are due by the end of July. There's no guarantee as to what their reality will look like moving forward. You have Sky City, as I referred to earlier. They're also kind of facing a new reality. So I guess I say all that to ask, like, what do you think the what do you think that the current reality like really looks like? I mean, especially as compared to generations past, like it feels like we've gone through this period in the market where they had all this chaos, and now things might be calming down a little bit, but there's still a lot of uncertainty and kind of there's just I think a lot of people are kind of looking at each other and trying to figure out how things go from here. I mean, what's your take on kind of the current reality and then maybe like let's say a few years or so into the future?
Well, let's start with Crown. It's the one that got into trouble first, but they seem to have got out of it
Sure.
first as well. So Crown had its license not suspended, but they were considered to be unsuitable to hold their license,
Yep.
but were allowed to continue to operate with a special manager, which is like a personalised regulator
Yep.
operating from within their four walls. That's in the Melbourne casino, but that's the major property that they have. Crown has survived that process. They've been given their licenses back in an unencumbered form in Victoria, where Crown Melbourne is, and in New South Wales, where Crown Sydney is. And they're also okay in Western Australia with Crown Perth. So they've got their licenses back. Their problem, though, is going to be more of a commercial nature because the business has changed. The business model that they were built on, the way they operated, basically had two market segments. There was a locals market, which includes interstate travellers coming to the various casinos in Perth, Melbourne, and Sydney. But they also had about a third of their business coming as internationals. And that international business has substantially dried up. There are still international tourists, but that's not what Crown was really surviving on. They had a major junket program with players coming from Asia, primarily from China, mainland China, and that market has completely disappeared. And they have to find a way to rebuild their business, knowing that that market has changed. Now, I think international will return to some degree in time, but it won't return in the way it was with junkets providing those players, because junkets are now banned in Australia. Excuse me. So they're going to have to think about how to change their business model, but at least they're over the regulatory hurdles. They have some consequential impacts based on their previous misbehaviour, in that the regulatory framework has changed, and that makes it more. That's going to make it more difficult for them as well, even with their locals market. For example, there's now a 3-hour limit on how long a person can play a slot machine before they need a 15-minute break, a maximum of 12 hours per day. There's an identification requirements for all players. There's going to be cashless. It is already there. There is cashless gaming in their casino in Melbourne now. Just as an aside, that's not a problem, cashless gaming, because the industry needs to go that way anyway. The problem for them is that it was forced on them, which means it's going to be more expensive to implement than if it had grown organically. So Crown, though, is at least over the regulatory hurdles. They've still got the problem, though, of making their business thrive, given the change in the market. Star, on the other hand, is in a much more difficult position. So Star's license, Star, the company, operates a casino in Sydney, one in Brisbane and one on the Gold Coast. Brisbane and Gold Coast about an hour apart. And its license in Sydney is under great threat. It was suspended. A manager was put in place to run the casino, which means that Star is still running the non-casino components of that property, the hotels, the theatre, the restaurants. They've got all that responsibility, but they're not running the casino. And a manager was appointed to run the casino for them. That's a difficult model. From a regulatory point of view, that's a difficult model, because it's difficult for the regulator to determine when the operator is suitable to get their license back, because they're not actually running the casino. So it's difficult for the regulator. So what the regulator has done is had an inquiry conducted by a man called Adam Bell. He provided his findings, which were scathing. Star was given an opportunity to reform, remediate its problems, and did an appalling job at that. In fact, in that process, it wanted to go to war with the regulator, which is a really bad strategy, compounded by putting it in writing, which is even worse. Star is in real trouble. Now, if we'd had this interview 24 hours ago, I would have said Star's chances of losing its license altogether were about 50-50, I would have thought, given what had gone on. So the regulator had given Star a second chance and it blew it. So it's now on its third chance. And it's difficult for a regulator to come back after having given an operator a second chance and say, okay, I won't take your license away now either. I could have done it last time and didn't, gave you a second chance. Maybe I can't give it, maybe I should extend it again, or do I cancel your license? It's a difficult decision. And the reason that 24 hours from yesterday till today makes a difference is that Star appointed a new CEO of the company yesterday, who happens to have been the person who got Crown out of its first set of difficulties as well, a guy called Steve McCann. He's not a casino executive other than the fact that he ran Crown when he got into trouble and to fix it. Initially, it started the remediation program. Then Blackstone bought Crown and he left, but he's well respected by the regulator as having put the wheels in motion. So having appointed Steve McCann as the CEO of the company yesterday, I think that increases the chances of Star getting its license back. But it's still maybe 60-40 that it will get its license back, maybe 75-25. It's not it won't get its license back straight away. There's no doubt about that at all. What they would be hoping for is to get the term of the manager extended rather than having their license pulled altogether. As I said, yesterday, 50-50 chance of getting its license pulled altogether. Now maybe a 40% chance of having its license pulled, and a 60% chance of having the term of the manager extended to give them further time to remediate. In fact, the more I think about it, it's more likely 70-30 chance of getting their license extended or the term of the manager extended rather than having the license pulled. But it's uncomfortable for the regulator to have to do that. The regulator doesn't really want to be seen to be giving these big casino companies too many chances. The regulator gets accused of allowing these companies being too big to fail. It wouldn't be a comfortable decision, but it's probably the right decision because the counterfactual is the other problem. If you take the license away, you've got to go through a new licensing process, and that in itself would be no fun for anyone.
So I'm really glad that you used that phrase "too big to fail" because that was going to be my next question. Is like, let's say we're in a reality where the license is revoked, or something along those lines. What does that look like? Because you know these casinos and these companies are huge employers in the states in which they operate, and obviously the revenue, the state revenue that comes from them. So that push and pull dynamic of like we want to regulate them hard, we want to be stern, but we also, we're kind of affecting ourselves to a certain degree if we shut this down. Would that even look like if the license were to be revoked?
Let's be clear. If the license is revoked, the casino stays open. What
Okay.
happens is the regulator puts a manager in place and then will then relicense it to someone else who passes probity and has the technical capacity and the financial strength to operate it. So
Okay,
the
so they
casino
would just have
closed.
somebody else. They would just have another operator come in and take over the license.
Another operator would be offered to someone else. So initially a manager would go in to run it, which is what's happening in Sydney at the moment. Really, a manager has been appointed by the regulator in a temporary measure. And if the regulator decided to revoke its license, it would then put a manager in place and then go through a licensing program. And we're talking about Star could apply for that license by the time you've been through that relicensing process. It might have done enough remediation internally to be suitable to get it again. Keep in mind that revoking a license is just for the casino floor, which is only a component of the whole complex.
Okay.
Star would still have responsibility for the rest of the complex, and that in itself is complicated. Like who has responsibility for cameras, for compliance when you're walking from one part to somewhere else? where's the footage stored? So it's a complicated story. Nobody wants it to happen. I shouldn't say nobody wants it to happen. There'd be some people who'd probably be happy for it to happen, but generally within the industry, nobody wants it to happen. But it's the too big to fail argument is not really correct in the sense that the casino would continue to operate. That's a policy decision of government to have a casino in Melbourne, one casino in Melbourne, 2 casinos in New South Wales, 4 in Queensland. They're the policy decisions. Those casinos would continue, but the operator might change.
I got you. That makes sense. And I wanted to touch on one other thing that you said, and I actually didn't know this, but so there are no junkets anymore. That is completely gone, or is it only in certain states?
It's completely gone. It was only really happening in Victoria, New South Wales, and Western Australia, a small amount on the Gold Coast. But those states have all said no more junkets. Now, my personal view is that there'll be a vacuum to be filled there. And I've always considered that junkets in Australia were, when I was a regulator, were glorified travel agents who were bringing customers to the casinos, helping them to access money, access travel documents, and that sort of stuff. But they were not, in my time, actually allowed in the casino to operate any of the gaming. That changed after I left, and that was one of the mistakes that was made, allowing junket operators into the casino. But I can't see why you wouldn't have these travel agents consolidating customers from Asian jurisdictions and bringing them to Crown Melbourne, Crown Perth, Star, Sydney, or the new Queen's Wharf, Brisbane property, which opens later this year or maybe perhaps next year. I can't see why those travel agents won't consolidate travel. It's just like these days you can have consolidated trips to see the flowers of England or the cathedrals of Rome or whatever. I could see that happening. And whilst the Chinese government is quite clear that it's not happy for its population to travel to gamble anymore, like they didn't seem to mind previously, there's a lot of Asia there that's not part of China as well. And there's a lot of growth going on in countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and they're not far away from Australia. I mean, Indonesia is only a few hours from Australia. It's quite a long way from Melbourne because Melbourne's at the south, but it's still closer than Las Vegas and still closer than the Arab Emirates will be if they ever build their Wynn casino. So there's still room, I think, for non-junket style travel agents to bring customers to the casino, but they won't be able to share in the proceeds from the casino itself.
That's interesting, and I think that ties back to what we were talking about, how the VIP sector was such a huge part of that business that is now pretty much gone. So I think like you said, I think that definitely creates a void there that who time will tell if and when that'll be kind of filled. Um, Looking ahead, and I know we're just obviously people on the sidelines, kind of just forecasting or kind of making observations, but like one thing that I've kind of wondered to myself just from afar is like the chances of, and I know Blackstone has already kind of come in. They've already obviously taken over. They bought Crown, so I guess in a way they've already kind of come in through that way. But like a future where whether it's because of business difficulties or because of regulatory difficulties or both or whatever it may be, that the chances of Star and Crown, these two titans of the Australian industry, either one or both of them really not sticking around long term. I mean, is that something that you think is really like plausible, or do you think that in some way, shape, or form those two main brands will kind of survive, or kind of what's your take on that kind of situation?
Um, Crown will likely survive. It's a more valuable brand and it's better recognised. Star is reasonably well known, but is in such poor position at the moment. It wouldn't surprise if the Star brand did change. So Star operates 3 properties, 2 in Queensland and 1 in Sydney. They're opening a new one in Queensland. When they do that, the old one will close. And it's the consortium building is called Destination Brisbane Consortium, and it's meant to be called Star Brisbane, I assume. There's a possibility that Star, the company, so Star Entertainment, might sell off the Sydney property and concentrate all its efforts on its new glamorous property in Brisbane. Now, Brisbane's a much more smaller city than Sydney, so Sydney makes more economic sense, but that's only if you're able to hold on to your license. And they've made such a bad job of their relationship with the regulator, although, as I said, new CEO yesterday could change that quite quickly. Yeah, I could see the possibility that Star Sydney might go into the fall into the hands of somebody else and be rebranded as part of that deal, where Star Brisbane might become the premium property, or effectively that and Gold Coast, but the only properties of Star, that company. Now, it's also possible Star Entertainment, the corporate entity, could be bought out, and in so doing, a new operator or a new owner might choose to rebrand the properties as well. That's also possible. One of the suggestions, and it's only a suggestion without any substance behind it, is that Blackstone, as the owner of Crown Sydney, might be interested in buying Star, either the company or the Sydney property, to help it with its problems that it has in Sydney. So the problems that Blackstone have in Sydney is that that casino in Sydney was built for international business, and there isn't any, or there's not as much to fulfill its objectives. And they don't have slot machines. Unusual for a casino not to have slot machines, but it doesn't. That was part of the deal they did with the New South Wales government. One way to get slot machines is to buy Star in Sydney, which is literally just across a bit of water. They're not that far apart, the two properties. So you could have two campuses, if you like, for one operator in Sydney. Now, I stress, Blackstone is not saying they're doing that. It's just conjecture that people see a logical pathway for Blackstone to get slot machines by buying the opposition effectively and consolidating them into one property. We do know that Star, the company, has said that there have been some tire kickers coming to talk to them about the possibility of either taking over the company or perhaps buying Sydney. I'm not sure it was clear to me which option. I think it was about buying the company. Whether that's Blackstone or whether that's someone else is not known. We do know it's not Hard Rock.
I was just about to say, are you sure it's not Hard Rock? Because I don't
I'm
know if they're
confident
sure.
it's not Hard Rock. We know that there was a person who purported to be from Hard Rock.
Yes. One of my
who
favorite stories
spoke to them. Did you see the Inside Asian Gaming version of that story?
I
Written by
did.
Andrew Scott? Yeah.
And what did he referred to as a not fit to operate a chook raffle, I believe is what his line was. So that was
Something like that. So the one company we do know is not interested at the moment is Hard Rock, but that doesn't mean, I have no idea who the other possibilities might be, whether they're private equity funds, whether they're a major operator from Asia or the US, or someone who has other gambling interests in Australia. Remember, we have a very big slot machine industry in hotels and clubs, bars and clubs around most of the states of Australia, and there's some big operators in that space as well who may or may not have an interest in looking at Star and thinking that they could do something with it. So we know there are people looking. We just don't know who they are. As we said, we know one of them that it's not, but we just don't know who they are. And if Star Sydney was bought out of separately, or even if Star the company was changed, the Star brand is not as valuable as the Crown brand, I think. Others may disagree, but I think the Crown brand has more value in it. So I don't really see that name changing.
interesting. It'll definitely be interesting to follow. And I have one more question on the casino side of things. We have some other topics I want to get to, but on terms of the casinos, we were talking a lot about Sydney and the Sydney market. Um, the tax, there was a big kind of development and story over the last year about casino tax increases in New South Wales. Um, could you kind of break that down? Like, I understand that it was deferred. It was kind of it was a last minute change. I know it was like Star was very much concerned about how it would affect their operational abilities. It was then changed at the last minute and then deferred. Could you kind of explain that for people who may not be familiar? Because that was a big story that was kind of difficult to follow, at least from my end.
It's an example of how weak the casino operators had become, that they weren't even in the loop to know that this was being contemplated. No government would take that sort of move to say they're going to raise casino taxes against a stronger casino operator. The end result, just go to the end first, is that disappeared when there was a change of government.
Yeah.
So the government that proposed the large increase in taxes did so knowing full well that they were unlikely to win the election. Now, it wasn't a clear-cut result, but they were behind in the polls, so they probably knew they were never going to have to implement it. So there might have been a bit of politics there to look like they were being tough on a casino operator that had been misbehaving, to look like they were doing something about it, knowing full well that they probably weren't going to see it through. So that tax change did not take place. However, governments still see casinos as valuable sources of revenue. The general order in Australia for governments is that slot machine venues not in casinos are the big provider of tax. The next big provider is sort of tied between lottery operators and casinos. So it's still a valuable source of revenue for government. So you can see them being interested, but it's a question of whether or not it is too onerous on casinos to do that. And what had been suggested in New South Wales was considered to be too onerous and was probably never likely to proceed. It may well have sent Star broke, irrespective of any of its other problems that it was encountering. It was just going to be too onerous. So I suspect it might have been more political than practical in its application.
Sure, and of course, we also see that from time to time here in the States as well. And part of you mentioned the bar, the pub and club aspect
Yeah,
of this. This is a huge part of the Australian market,
yeah.
and it has been, again, now this is from an outsider's perspective, just looking in, but it has been fascinating over the last few years to see the push and pull between the two sides in terms of the casino operators are having to deal with all these things, all these regulatory issues. They're paying fines. They're doing all these things. They're going through all the hoops, and a consistent theme or something that is often said from the casino side is that we need to have an even playing field in the sense that the pub and club operators don't usually go through the same, they don't have the same environment, or they don't have the same reality as the casino side. um, that's another part of this that, again, from an outsider's perspective, is very interesting to me. So could you kind of like break that down in terms of like the play between the two sides and how the pub and club industry has kind of been chugging along even with like all of these developments on the casino side? Because that's a fascinating part of this whole thing to me.
So let's talk a little bit first about the market. So we're talking about the same machines. The
Sure.
same slot machines are available in casinos as are available in hotels and clubs in every state in Australia except Western Australia. Western Australia is unique in that it does not have slot machines outside the casino. Every other state and territory does. Um, there are 220,000 slot machines or something like that outside casinos in Australia. So we're talking about a very wide distribution.
Yeah.
Apart from the clubs in New South Wales, though, they are generally in smaller amounts. So there might be a 40 machine venue. In my state, Victoria, no more than 105 per venue, but the average is probably about 60 or 70 per venue. So there's about 600 venues, 550 venues in Victoria. There's about 3,000 venues in New South Wales, probably 700 in Queensland. So there's a lot of these venues, which means firstly that the patron doesn't have to travel to casinos to gamble if they don't want to. But importantly, they've got the same access to the same type of machine. So there's a view that why should a person that goes to play a game in a slot venue not have the same controls and restrictions and harm minimisation measures that are imposed on a casino? So governments have been effectively forced politically to put tougher controls on Crown and Star properties because of their misbehaviour, which leads to the next question of why aren't those same measures being put on hotels and clubs where these slot machines are? So what sort of measures are we talking about? The most obvious one is card-based play, where identification of players is necessary with card-based play and time limits on the amount that you can spend. Hotels and clubs clearly don't want that to happen, but it's difficult politically for governments to impose it on one part of the industry, being the casinos, and not put it on hotels and clubs. On the other hand, they know the hotels and clubs are very powerful lobby groups with a lot of influence on voters. So it's a very fine line politically for governments. Now, and just stress, this is governments making policy decisions in Australia. Regulators don't do it, they just enforce it. So it's a decision of governments, and it's a very fine line they're walking at the moment politically to get the right outcome they're looking for. If you wanted to be cynical, you could say that harm minimisation for politicians means harm at the next election. That's what worries them more, some of them more, than necessarily the actual genuine harm that these machines might cause if they're not appropriately managed. We have a strong harm minimisation flavour to our games. There are a lot of restrictions that have been in place for 25 years on machines that have been there to try and minimise harm. There's an acceptance that the machines can cause harm if they're not used properly or if their use is abused. So there are, or there've always been restrictions in place. But the question is whether the new restrictions that have been imposed at Star and Crown, which were unavoidable politically, should necessarily be added to the hotels and clubs. And in some respects, I think they will eventually. But I think governments will take their time, see how they work in the casinos before they enforce it on hotels and clubs. So at the moment, hotels and club machines, whilst they're the same machines, they're Aristocrat machines and IGT machines and Light and Wonder machines, same machines, same maths, mostly the same operational requirements. There are some harm minimisation additional features required at casinos than you'll see in hotels and clubs.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but there was recently an initiative that required all bars and clubs from removing all gaming related signage. Were they not, or was that only in one state?
That was a New South Wales decision. In fact, the signage that was required to be removed didn't say gaming. It was code for gaming. It was called VIP lounge.
Yeah.
If it said had a VIP lounge, that meant it had slot machines. They're known here as poker machines or pokies.
Yep.
In Victoria, for the last over 20 years, you can't advertise them at all. You're only allowed to put up one sign. I think it's two if you're on a corner, and it's only allowed to say pokies. That's it. You can't say anything else. It's been a restricted marketplace anyway. Just in New South Wales, they tightened up on the VIP lounge because they felt that it was so obviously code. Everybody knew what it meant and sort of defeated the purpose of a ban. So it's a bit unnecessary in New South Wales because just about every venue has poker machines anyway. It's a bit different in Victoria where there are far fewer machines. There's only about 1 in 6 hotels here in Victoria have poker machines. It's much bigger numbers in New South Wales and Queensland.
It was interesting to me to see, I don't know if it was like on the official, I don't know if there was like an official release or like official press release with this on it, but there was like a list of like the language, like you said, it was like VIP lounge. I think one of them was like anything that had dragon in it or something like that. You know what I mean? Like it was interesting to see.
Yeah, and it's always been a little bit difficult for governments because the job of the industry is to try and find a way through the regulatory maze, or if you like, to go around the regulatory maze. And the more you prescribe something, the more people will find a way around it because they say, well, it's not prescribed, so therefore I'm allowed to do it.
Sure, definitely, yeah. And I think, as like we alluded to earlier, I think as the casino environment gets a little hairy or a little bit more challenging or uncertain, I think the pub and club scene is really an interesting part of this whole ecosystem for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
And they're a very powerful group, particularly the clubs in New South Wales.
sure.
So the difference between a club and a hotel is that a club is not for profit. Hotels are profitable commercial businesses. And it's the clubs in New South Wales which are much more powerful than the hotels. That's partly because they've had slot machines since the 1950s. They were introduced into New South Wales in mid-1950s. So it's ingrained been there for generations. And it's ingrained in society as a thing to do is to go to the club. So they're very, very powerful, far more powerful than anywhere else in Australia.
And these are like fraternal clubs and other organizations such as that, or like
They're sporting clubs, ethnic clubs, return services or veterans clubs.
sure.
The club is determined by their liquor license, but to be a club, you've got to show you're not for profit. So all your revenues have to go back to serve your members, which means because they've had poker machines for a long time, some of these clubs are very, very wealthy, but they can't distribute the money to their people, so they put it back into their facilities. And the population of New South Wales likes that. They like their clubs to be comfortable. They like their food to be discounted because they can afford to do it because of the revenue they get from their gaming. It's a lifestyle choice that people have been making in New South Wales for 50 odd years or 70 years.
Sure. You know, one, and now I want to kind of switch to the regulatory side of things. We've kind of touched on it briefly as we've gone along, but I really do think it's worth noting at least the simple fact that as the industry has changed, so too has the regulatory side of it, to the extent that you have new bodies being formed, you have new policies being put in place. You have a really big federal presence. I know you mentioned Austrac and ACMA. I know is very much involved in this. Um, and it's just interesting to me because, as being a native Nevadan, I'm so used to the idea of like the regulators being like this sort of like static body that never changes and is always this one thing that has always been this way. You know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? So it's been interesting for me to follow the market and to see just it seems like there's been such a change on the regulatory side of things. And that's why I was anxious to have you on because I know you obviously have direct experience in this. And I'm just curious to kind of hear your thoughts on how this evolution has kind of unfolded to where it's just different. It's a different environment. It seems like, and I don't say this in like a particularly nasty way or anything, but it seems like both sides are kind of like reacting on the fly. You know what I mean? It seems like everyone's kind of dancing to the tune a little bit. So I'm just curious to just hear your thoughts on that side of things because it's just interesting to me.
Every state and territory has a gambling regulator,
Yeah.
and the gambling regulators are considered to be independent of the political side of government. Governments establish them, and as a regulator, I can say to you that the whole time I was a regulator, I was never asked by a government official, a minister or a minister's office staff or anybody from the political side, never asked to make a particular decision. Okay. We were asked to enforce the law. We were asked to implement new policy initiatives, but never asked to take a form of disciplinary action against someone or grant or refuse a license or grant or refuse to approve a game. That was always that. It's always understood that the regulator is independent and makes those decisions accordingly. When regulators don't do the job that the public wants, the government gets concerned because they can't tell the regulator what to do. So the next best thing is to reform the regulator, make a change to the regulator. I can recall being told, I wasn't there, so it's hearsay, but I recall being told once that a minister who had responsibility for gaming in one jurisdiction where there was change, the only question he asked was, have we used the name of this organisation before? Have we gone from calling it an authority to a commission? That was enough. He just wanted to see that there was substantive change to the name, didn't care what was going on underneath it, because change looks like progress. So a lot of the changes that are made are more superficial than they sound, but the most recent changes in New South Wales and Victoria are substantive, and that is that the governments have been compelled to re-establish what seems like standalone casino operators separate from gaming. I suspect they'll regret that decision in about 3 years' time, but they've been forced to do it through the way inquiries have occurred. The reason I think they'll regret it is because there's not enough skill set to go around to cover casinos separately from slot venues. Remember, we're talking about the same type of machines being used here. But also you end up with casino inspectors getting too close to the casinos they regulate if that's all they do. Whereas if you have a regulator that does casinos and slot venues and charitable gaming and sports betting and lotteries, you can rotate your inspectors through different activities and stop them getting captured by the industry, which is how we ran it successfully when I was a regulator. This model of a separate standalone casino operator, even if it's just a branch within the regulator, has flaws in its operation, which will come home to roost in about 3 years' time and probably we'll see change again. But I mean, in the time that we've had a casino in Victoria, the casino's had 3 owners, there's been 5 different regulators, but they're basically the same regulator. So the job doesn't change, the core activity doesn't change, the regulator still has independence from government in its decision making. It isn't a lot different to pretty much just name change more than anything else.
Sure, sure. And we've been talking a lot, obviously, about Star Sydney and the second Bell inquiry, and obviously, David Foster made a lot of headlines with his comment that he wanted to abolish the NICC, but obviously he then explained that what he meant was more that he wanted a regulatory body that would oversee the entire industry, and it kind of touches back on this topic of like segmentation, and it is just like I said, it's just fascinating. And the federal part of it is another part that's really interesting to me. Obviously, like you said, Austrac has been very busy. They've been issuing some pretty hefty. I think like I believe what was it, the fine for Crown? I believe it was like the second highest corporate fine ever in the country, in the history of the
I think it might
country.
have been third. I think there were two banks ahead of it. I think two banks got bigger fines, I think. But yeah, it's way up there. Absolutely way up there. Yeah.
So has that always been the case in terms of the federal part of it? Because that's a huge topic here in the States in terms of like everybody, all the operators, everybody in the industry here in the States, that's like the one thing that they don't want is federal intervention. That's the one thing that everyone can agree on in the industry is that they do not want federal intervention. Has that what's the role of that in Australia? Has it always been kind of so involved in that way?
Austrac has always had responsibility for financial um, transaction analysis. Whether it was doing the job is a more questionable activity. It was a reasonably secretive organisation. Even as a gaming regulator, I wasn't aware what they were doing because the federal law actually prevented the regulator, Austrac, from talking to the gaming regulator. So we were never quite sure. So we used to do a 5-yearly review of the casino operator in Victoria. And because we couldn't, we didn't have responsibility for anti-money laundering activity, we would contact Austrac and say, "Are you happy that Crown is doing everything they need to do?" And they would then give us a response, which we would put into this review and say, "We've been told by Austrac that Crown is compliant or Crown's improving its practices," or whatever the statement was. We couldn't do any more than that. As far as we knew, based on those reports, Austrac was happy with Crown. Now it turns out that either they were happy and didn't realise they shouldn't have been happy, or perhaps there were new activities that Crown participated in since that last report had been received. But Austrac, for whatever reason, has decided that the form of action they needed to take was a large fine against Crown. I think it's in Australian dollars, I think it was 420 million spread over 6 years. Sky City, it's about 67 million Australian dollars, which is what, about 40 million US, I suspect. The Star, we don't know what the number will be. There's various views of what Star's number is going to be. There's an argument that it ought to be more than Crown because their behaviour continued on well after they knew it was wrong to do it. On the other hand, it's a not very big company and can't afford much anymore. So who knows? But anyway, but Star still has to do that as well. And Austrac has subsequently said they're now looking more closely at the slot venues. We know they've been looking at betting companies as well, that some of the big betting companies are also now in their sights as well. So Austrac has decided, for whatever reason, that the cash reporting responsibilities of the gambling industry needed a closer look and a stronger form of attention. There's the second regulator, you mentioned it, the ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, is not really a gaming regulator, it's a media regulator. The federal government uses it as a de facto gaming regulator for sports betting, online sports betting, and to stop online gaming, those casino games and slot games that are illegal in Australia. ACMA, has the responsibility for enforcing that law. And it's not really a gaming regulator per se. It's just a side job that's asked to take on.
Just another a participant in this grand show. They're just
yeah. And look, I'm not sure that people who work at ACMA necessarily see that should be their core activity or one of their responsibilities. But nevertheless, that's how the law has been structured in Australia at the federal level. Under the Australian Constitution, where a federal law and a state law cover the same thing, the federal law wins out. So the federal government puts in a ban on interactive gambling, they've then got to enforce it.
I will say though, I do enjoy reading the periodical ACMA release about how many sites that they've blocked and what they're up to in terms of a total. What is it, like 9? Everyone is like, we've blocked 6 more sites. Now we're up to 962.
Yeah, they said they've blocked 995 since 2019. Now the law came into effect in 2001, so I don't know what happened between 2001 and 2019. Looks like they didn't block any, but a better model would have been, and still is, to regulate online gaming. The states all had an online gaming part in their legislation. They worked together to put an online gaming regulatory regime in place. federal government law came in 2001 and overrode it. So that's why we don't have online gaming in Australia. And I suspect the federal government of today is probably sorry that it's been lumbered with that responsibility and would have preferred the states take responsibility. But it's it's one of those things. Once the law is in place, very hard to get out of that law even if they wanted to.
Sure, sure. I could imagine. Um, so I want to touch briefly. I'm not, so I will admit, in terms of the overall ecosystem, I'm much more familiar with the casino side of things, the sports betting part of it. Um, I know that Tabcorp is a big name that has had some they've had their own troubles as of recently. They just appointed a new CEO recently. Hopefully, they're hoping that he can turn things around and kind of win back some of that market share. One big kind of topic as it relates to sports betting is the partnerships or the sports related team partnerships that you had mentioned. Um, what is kind of what would you say the sports betting industry, have they felt the same type of pain, or have they kind of been relatively quiet throughout this period as it relates to the overall gaming industry? What would you say?
For the last 5 years, maybe longer, they've been feeling a different sort of pain.
Sure.
The community feels there's too much advertising of sports betting through online, television, sports sponsorship, ground sponsorship. And I think the big operators would agree, but they're trying to keep their market share. And I think if a ban were to come in, they'd probably actually be quite happy, the big ones, because if you've got your market share and advertising a ban, it's probably hard for anyone to take your position. But sports betting is popular and it's well regulated. It's been legal in Australia for over 40 years. Most of it is done online using people on their phones these days, using an app, but it is available widely. Most of them are regulated and licensed in the Northern Territory, and that's because it's got the most favourable regulatory regime for them. But again, under the Australian Constitution, if you're licensed in one state, you can operate in any other state. And so most of them are licensed in the Northern Territory, where they feel they have a form of regulation that they're comfortable with and a tax rate that they like. And other states recognise that that's just going to happen. The federal government is there through ACMA to try and control what the advertising, that's why it's with ACMA, because of the advertising part of the activity of their marketing activities. I think they will find they are also a little bit exposed on OddsTrack at the moment. We know OddsTrack is looking at some of the betting companies, and I won't name companies because I can't remember which ones specifically, and I don't want to name the wrong ones, but they have named a couple that they're looking at, and they're the big of these bigger operators. But we have a lot of licensed betting companies in this country. Sports betting is huge, but it's well regulated. So in Victoria, there is a scheme where a sport can be approved by the gaming regulator. If it's approved by the gaming regulator, which means it's got integrity procedures in place, then a betting company must have an agreement with that sport before it can place bets on that sport's activities. Now, the reason for that is to force the betting company and the sporting body to negotiate an integrity agreement where the betting company pays the sporting code. The sporting code uses that money for integrity purposes, to make sure its players are not betting on their own activities and so on. It's a good model and helps keep the sport clean by making sure sport has enough money to pay for the integrity processes necessary to ensure that its sport is not compromised.
So that's interesting, especially as it relates to the U.S. market, where we are seeing all types of issues on the sports betting side of things as it relates to integrity. Some huge, very damning stories in a variety of states. So it sounds like it's more how would you say it's kept under control a little bit better, would you say, or how would you?
Yes, and part of that is because it's been around for 40 years. So regulatory schemes grow organically as you learn processes. It's relatively new in America, which makes it more difficult to put those measures in place. That model I was talking about, we implemented that in 2008. So it's been around for 16 years and it works very, very well. One of the reasons it works, I remember it's a state-based system. It works because it's in the state of Victoria, which is the major state where most of the major sporting activities have at least one activity a year. They wouldn't dare not come to Melbourne because that's second biggest city in Australia, or biggest city in Australia now, biggest sporting crowds. So the Victorian law applies because they're active in Victoria, but the law actually only applies in Victoria, but that's enough to give coverage to the whole country.
Gotcha, gotcha. And there, you had mentioned the advertising ban. Is that the proposed? I know that there's a currently being debated as a proposed 3-year tiered online advertising ban. Is that what you were referring to, or is that a separate issue?
Yes, but that was only a recommendation of a parliamentary inquiry. It
Sure,
hasn't yet received endorsement from the government that that's what they propose to do. We have a federal election here due any time between probably August this year and March next year. It, in my mind, questionable whether or not that would be addressed prior to the election. It
sure,
may have to wait, but I think there will be some form of restriction on advertising that comes out of the inquiry. It's a well-respected inquiry. It wasn't partisan. It had both sides, both the major sides of politics involved in it. So I think it will get some coverage, but it probably won't implement all of it, because an advertising ban would affect sport badly, not through the fact that the sports can't get the revenue directly, but the companies that pay for the sports rights won't have as much revenue because they rely on the betting revenue to pay for the sports rights. So I think the government will be concerned about professional sport being impacted heavily. So might want a more nuanced approach than was necessarily recommended by the parliamentary inquiry. The parliamentary inquiry has no real status other than the fact that government is obliged to look at it. And they're likely to look at it, I suspect, reasonably favourably, but not necessarily every part that was recommended. And that won't satisfy everyone.
sure, sure. And it's just fascinating to me to think that in a span of perhaps, whatever it is, 6 to 8 months, you have three of the biggest markets in the world, the US, the UK, and Australia, that are all dealing with election related, gambling related issues in terms of the election. So that it's just really an interesting time, especially for those like yourself who are like really involved in it day to day. It's definitely a fascinating time here for not only just the Australian industry, but the entire global gaming community. We are really seeing interesting times as of late. Um, One thing I want to get you out of here on this, and I thank you again so much. This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and I think our viewers will too, because this is just like I said, I think it's just a fascinating market and a fascinating issue. Um, One thing that I'm interested in is the public perception part of it, because in Australia, as we've established, the appetite for gaming is so strong. Australian bettors or punters, however you say it, are widely considered to be some of like the most enthusiastic, the most loyal. Um, but yet here we are in a situation where, like we said, there's been a lot of unfavorable press and developments for the industry. And do you think that that eventually kind of takes a toll on the public perception, or do you think that the appetite remains strong? They just need to figure out kind of the operational part of it, or how do you think the public discourse plays into this? Because I just think, like I said, I think it's hard to imagine that the last few years, with all of the things that have gone on, that there might be a bit of a bad taste in people's mouths at this point in time.
I think what has happened is probably just polarized the discussion further. So the people who are always anti-gambling are even more vehement in their anti-gambling approach.
Sure,
The
sure.
people that gamble want to continue to gamble. I think those that were sort of neutral, sitting on the fence, are probably a little bit more concerned about the impact that gambling might be having on the community than they might have been before. So I think the industry has damaged itself, but probably not irretrievably. It's not the first time that the industry has faced that possibility that its unpopularity is damaging, and they've recognised that and gone away and, if you like, internally reformed to provide better services and generated more respect from their local communities. And I think that's what will happen here. Certainly, the anti-gambling voices are stronger and more powerful. But I think the revenue figures we're seeing from domestic gambling suggest that the domestic player doesn't care. They're still going to continue to gamble. They enjoy it. They like it. They want to keep doing it.
Definitely. Well, no matter how it turns out, we'll be here to cover it. Thank you so much again, Peter, for having this discussion with me. I'm sure we will be talking as there are more crazy, whatever the next crazy development may be. I'm sure I will be in touch. But thank you again, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks very much, Jess. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on the GGB podcast, sponsored by Pavilion Payments, the industry's leading cashless payment provider. To learn more about the topics discussed today and all the important issues in gaming, check out Global Gaming Business Magazine. For a free virtual copy of the magazine, subscribe at ggbmagazine.com. To stay current with the weekly news of the gaming industry, subscribe to ggbnews.com. Use the coupon code GGB180 for a free subscription. Don't miss a single episode of the GGB podcast. Subscribe on Amazon, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts today. So we'll see you next time on the GGB podcast.